Trump started a trade war with Canada. Canada decided we're not going to surrender. And Trump now is reacting like a guy who flipped over the monopoly board because no one would let him buy Park Place. Except it's not monopoly, it's international trade. It affects hundreds of billions of dollars. And Trump seems genuinely furious that Canada will not simply do whatever he tells them to do. How dare they think about what's best for them? So Trump spent yesterday just attacking Canada in a series of increasingly bizarre posts after Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said, we're not going to accept these demands. Trump wrote, Canada's been ripping the USA off for decades. They're charging our farmers tariffs of 400% or more. Canada's driving American businesses out of business. Now, all of this stuff is either straight up false or very misleading. For example, the 400% claim. Canada has very high over quota tariffs on certain dairy products, but those rates apply only after the dairy free, it's soy tariffs. No, after the tariff free quotas have been exceeded and the lower tariff quotas have been exceeded. But Trump doesn't care about that. He's angry because he has this negotiating strategy, which is everybody should bow down to me. And it's not working. He imposed tariffs. He said and thought and believed, I guess, Canada was going to panic. And Canada was going to run back and say, Mr. Trump, please, what do we have to do to make it stop? And Mark Carney is like, yeah, we're not going to do that. Now, one sticking point apparently is about Trump's demands to weaken protections for the French language in Canada. Trump came back and was like, I never said they couldn't speak French, but that's not what it was about. It was about packaging and labeling. And Mark Carney was just like, we're not going to do that either. So Trump announces 50% tariffs on $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. And then he starts this crazy posting spree. We would never interfere with Canadians speaking French. This is Canada's being the most difficult and unreasonable of any country I'm dealing with. And then he even had this insane statement where Trump said about Canada, they feel entitled, but they are not a state and will be entitled no longer. What's happening here is that Donald Trump grew up basically from the time he was a kid to expect others to behave a certain way with him. And now that Canada isn't behaving that way, Trump's incapable of interacting with them without reminding them of his fantasy that somehow a sovereign country will become the 51st US state, and then just posting time after time after time about Canada. Over the last 10 years, the U.S. lost on average $60 billion a year with Canada, no more. This is another confusion for Trump. Trump describes a trade deficit as losing. That is not how trade deficits work. But my favorite part of the tantrum is that Trump got so angry at Ontario, which, by the way, is where the Canadian auto industry is very important to American trade. He was so angry with Ontario that he said, you know what? They might force me to rename Lake Ontario Lake America. So this is the childish toddler mentality. Canada won't give me what I want, so I'm going to rename a lake and then I'll show them. Now, the slight complication, of course, not that he cares, is Lake Ontario is an international body of water. It's bordered by both the U.S. and Canada. And Canada's response to all of this, so much of this I summarized for you yesterday. Now Canada has had a chance to respond. They're so scared of what Trump is doing, they're going to buckle. No, they're not doing it. Canada has announced $20 billion in retaliatory tariffs on American goods. So the sort of sequence here, simplified, is Trump started a trade war. Canada didn't back down. Trump insulted them. Canada is now retaliating. Trump escalated. Canada's refusing to capitulate. Trump is escalating more and threatening and saying they're being difficult and unreasonable and I will rename a lake. And then they're going, yeah, we don't care. We're not impressed by any of this. The master negotiator, bringing in a businessman, is going to be so good for the presidency. Other countries will bend to my will because I'm so tough. And you think they were scared of Obama? No, they're scared of me. And instead, Canada has figured out something very important, which is Trump makes a lot of threats, but the threats only work if everybody is terrified to say, we're not going to bow down. And Canada has decided we are not going to bow down. Now, I got a couple of interesting questions in the email yesterday about what is the economic effect of these retaliatory tariffs? In other words, isn't there a zero-sum nature where if we put tariffs on 50 billion and they put tariffs on 50 billion, it just sort of balances out? The answer to this, you don't really need to go more deeply than to say, well, it balances out in terms of trade, but everybody ends up paying more for stuff. Like, you could make that the analysis and leave it there. The truth is the analysis is a little bit more nuanced, and we're not going to be able to complete that analysis here. But the concept would be, depending on what we tariff from Canada and what Canada tariffs from the United States, it might not just be zero sum in this sense. If we tariff final goods from Canada and this is hypothetical, and Canada tariffs component parts from the United States, which then are used to build higher value things in Canada, then that's probably worse for the United States than Canada. The details don't matter so much as the concept that what is being tariffed, the nature of what is being tariffed, how many substitutes there are for what is being tariffed. If we tariff something from Canada that there are easy alternatives for American businesses, then that changes versus whether it's something we can really only get from Canada. But it doesn't even really matter. The point is, trade wars make stuff more expensive for the average end user, the consumer. And this is when we're already in the middle of an affordability crisis. So it is a very bad idea. That's the important takeaway. Thanks for watching. Check out this other video. And if you like our content, make sure to subscribe so YouTube puts our videos in your feed, and subscribe to the podcast on Spotify and Apple.